The purpose of rest is to restore your soul. I think some of us need to just take a deep breath here. Rest in the presence of God, knowing that He intended for rest to be a gift to you. Rest is a gift from God. So our text today starts in Mark chapter 2, verse 23. It says this: One Sabbath, He, that's Jesus, was going through the grain fields. As they made their way, His disciples began to pluck heads of grain. So the Sabbath, like we said, is the day of rest. God has designed us to work hard, to be productive, to be fruitful, to have purpose. God doesn't want us to be lazy Christians. But He also designed us to need regular rest in which we are not performing the functions of our work. That is God's idea. And you can see this principle all the way throughout the Bible, this spiritual law. Most famously in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, you read the story of how God created the world, and it says that God created the earth in 6 days, and on the seventh day, He rested. In the book of Exodus, we read about Moses, this critical Jewish man that God speaks to and uses to lead the nation of Israel out of slavery, that Moses is receiving this law from God, and it includes the law to keep the Sabbath holy. Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 10 says this: Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. See, work hard. But the seventh day is a Sabbath day to the Lord. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. So everybody rest. Now, there was a point at which the Jewish leadership applied rules to the Sabbath that turned it into a burden. But the point is that the Sabbath was created by God as a gift for mankind, and that it's a good thing. The Sabbath is not a burden. It is a gift. And on this Sabbath day, which happened in the Jewish calendar every week from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday, this is the day of the week that Jesus and His disciples are walking through a grain field, and the disciples were picking heads of the grain to eat. This is called reaping, right? They are reaping the wheat and eating it. Verse 24 of Mark 2. The Pharisees were saying to Him, that's to Jesus, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And so the issue here is not that the disciples are reaping the grain. That's actually explicitly allowed within the law. It doesn't need to be your field for you to do the reaping and eat from it. The problem was that they were doing this on the Sabbath day. Right? 6 days a week, this is not a problem. But on this day, they've got issues. And the contention that the Pharisees have here is that Jesus and His disciples are disobeying the command of God that Moses had passed down to keep the Sabbath day holy. Verse 25, Jesus said to them, "Have you never read what David did?" So He's referring to something that happened ages ago. Have you not read what David did when he was in need and he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. So Jesus answers their question with a question of His own, and He talks about an incident that's recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 21. That's the story of how David and his companions, they were hungry, and so they went to the temple and they ate the consecrated bread. Right? That was a violation of the law, but they weren't condemned for it. It wasn't a violation because it was on the Sabbath. It was just not allowed. David and his friends were not the high priest, and the high priest was the only one who was allowed to eat the bread of the presence or the consecrated bread. Nobody else. And so Jesus is bringing up this story from the Old Testament, their holy text, and he's arguing with them not that the rules hadn't been broken, but rather that he's teaching that certain violations under certain conditions are warranted. In other words, Jesus is saying that human need is a higher law than religious ritualism. And if your spidey senses are tingling right now, that feels like a hard pill to swallow. You say, that feels off to me. I get it. But Jesus is not by any means rubber stamping sin and saying, let's just flout holiness. That's not important. That's not what's going on. But Jesus says this next, and it's really revealing. He said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. An intentional day of rest was not created for the sake of itself. The Sabbath was created as a gift for you. Its purpose is not to limit your fun. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I was at my sister last week. I ran out early here after the service because we had planned to visit my sister and her family, and they were at their camp at Spring Bay. And her mother-in-law was there, and we were on the boat, and we were towing one of those like floaty guys that the kids were like the tubes that you hold on to, and they're like flying up into the air, and they're having so much fun. Her mother-in-law is of a generation that believed that honoring the Sabbath meant you're not allowed to have fun. And so we had to promise that we would use the boat only away from the shore so we're not disturbing everybody else. And this idea, the Sabbath is not meant to limit your fun. It's not meant to limit your productivity. It is not meant to place a heavy burden on you and a new full set of restrictions. The Sabbath's purpose, rest's purpose, is to bring you life, to provide rest from labor and the opportunity to slow down enough to reach deeper levels of intimacy and worship with your heavenly Father. The purpose of rest is to restore your soul. I think some of us need to just take a deep breath here. Rest in the presence of God, knowing that He intended for rest to be a gift to you. Rest is a gift from God.